Nagel's project. Abandoning the search for natural teleology was a harbinger of modern science. Francis Bacon and others believed that the search for final causes corrupted science. Has this belief been tested and found wanting? Two reasons indicate that natural teleology is ripe for review. Firstly, contemporary scientists and philosophers have proven unable to reduce or eliminate natural teleological talk from biology, medicine, and even cosmology. Secondly, as Thomas Nagel argues, anti-teleological Darwinian materialism is unable to explain objective value and reason. The alternative, it's unable to explain the presence of mind in the cosmos. The alternative is natural teleology. Now, since historically teleology has been explained by a divine mind, God has purposes, some worry that to accept natural teleology is to sully nature with divinity. But Nagel rejects theism. So he defends a secular alternative, theology without theology. His hypothesis of naturalized Platonism or Aristotelianism answers the cosmic question of how rational, moral creatures like us came to be. In this paper, I argue that Nagel's case against anti-teleological naturalism is sound, but I quibble with his alternative on a couple of points. First, I'll summarize the main argument of mind and cosmos in two clean syllogisms, which together entail natural teleology. Second, I'll explain a bit more about natural teleology, which is the notion that there are some genuine teleological facts of nature, explicable by teleological laws, even without the intentions of a divine agent. Third, I shall suggest two criticisms. One, that despite the apparent disjunction, Nagel's hypothesis of natural teleology is compatible with certain kinds of atheism and certain kinds of theism, which should commend it to both kinds of philosophers. And that, two, his secular alternative is not very Platonic or Aristotelian. It may be right, but it is nothing more than Hegelian. So, the cosmic question. Would you mind hitting the little, not just only a few slides, but 8 slides, but yeah. So the cosmic question. Nagel's Mind and Cosmos offers his latest answer to what he playfully calls the cosmic question. The cosmic question is this, quote, how can one bring into one's individual life a recognition of one's relation to the universe as a whole, whatever that relation is? He calls the cosmic question a, quote, religious question, but argues it does not need a religious answer. We sort of have three options. Hard-headed atheists dismiss the question. We don't have a place in the cosmos. Religious people try to answer it with reference to this kind of overall divine plan. But Nagel thinks a secular answer is possible. Mind and Cosmos offers such an answer. Natural teleology is part of his strategy to answer the cosmic question while avoiding both reductionistic atheism and supernaturalistic theism. He's well aware of his idiosyncrasy and embraces the role of a gadfly. Okay, so the argument. The argument for natural teleology may be summarized in two neat syllogisms. The first, which I'll call non-reductionism, deconstructs reductive naturalism. The second, which I'll call non-theism, establishes a secular natural teleology. So yeah, the first one, this is non-reductionism. If reductive Darwinian naturalism is true, then human practical rationality is not objective. But practical rationality and value that we identify with our practical rationality is most likely objective. Therefore, reductive Darwinian naturalism is most likely false. Non-theism goes like this. Either teleology with theology, such as Christianity, or teleology without theology, such as naturalized Platonism or Aristotelianism, is most likely true. But teleology with theology is unacceptable. Therefore, secular natural teleology, such as naturalized Platonism or Aristotelianism, is most likely true. Let's look at each syllogism in a bit more detail. The first premise of non-reductionism opposes moral realism to the standard Darwinian account of the origin of human life. Although not all agree with this opposition, and I have some more detail in the footnotes if you'd like. Nagel follows a familiar line of thought, well articulated by Sharon Street, that moral realism can't be true if we simply evolved our moral, practical reasoning capacities in virtue of sort of, all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with morality, like survival and cooperation and things like that. The crucial premise is the second one. Practical rationality is most likely objective. Why take moral realism over one version of Darwinism? Why take the, quote, realist position that our responses try to reflect the evaluative truth and can be correct or incorrect by reference to it, unquote, instead of Darwinism, or one version at least? The case for the objectivity of value and practical reason is one Nagel has been polishing for decades. I can only provide an outline here. He starts by saying moral realism is the default view. It is a defeasible presumption. Pre-reflectively, most of us have no objection to the seeming fact that some of our reasons for acting are good reasons and some of them are bad. So the burden of proof lies with moral realism's opponents. Anti-realism doesn't necessarily need to be refuted, it just needs to be shown that it's not as plausible as our default view of moral realism. The alternative to moral realism he calls subjectivism, which is a placeholder term for expressivisms, quasi-realism, moral nihilism, constructivism, and any view that, quote, makes evaluative and moral truth depend on our motivations, dispositions, and responses, unquote. So, subjectivism derives what plausibility has from two contentions, neither of which is enough to render it more plausible than realism. First, subjectivists contend that value judgments with objective purport are really just masks for subjective psychological states. Nagel concedes there are some pockets of subjectivity that seem objective but can be unmasked. He gives the examples of grammar and etiquette. They seem objective, but you can show that some grammatical rules are just local to English or whatever. He says, in response, though, we cannot justifiably generalize local unmaskings to the conclusion that all seemingly objective judgments are really just subjective. Instead, such unmaskings ought to be accommodated within an overall view of objectivity. Second, subjectivists observe that our motives, attitudes, desires, approvals, rationalizations are all features of our psychology. Nagel concedes that such psychological states are the starting point of practical reasoning. However, it is always in order to ask a variation on Moore's open question: ought I to be motivated by these psychological states? Ethics begins with the psychological states and then subjects these to, quote, subjects these impulses to examination, codification, questioning, criticism, and so on, unquote. It seems that practical reasoning is something over and above just our desires or approvals and things. While Nagel allows that he's not refuted skepticism, nevertheless, the defeasible presumption of moral objectivity has not been dislodged. In a closing diatribe I find persuasive, he says, quote, I remain convinced that pain is really bad and not just something we hate, and that pleasure is really good and not just something we like. That is just how they glaringly seem to me, however hard I try to imagine the contrary. And I suspect the same is true of most people. The scientific credentials of Darwinism are not enough to dislodge the immediate conviction that objectivity is not an illusion with respect to the basic judgments of value. So that's the non-reductionism. Non-theism. Nagel's non-theism argument is even more likely to ruffle feathers. The first premise creates a disjunction between supernatural teleology with a god and natural teleology without. Nagel concedes that teleological explanations are often appeals to the actions of an agent, as when I talk about my own intentions and desires and plans and projects. But he maintains that we are not rationally obligated to countenance a supernatural designer. Nagel is rather hospitable to his theistic interlocutors, even the much maligned proponents of intelligent design. Is he slouching towards theism? No, theism is not for him. Echoing his famous statement in the last word, where he said, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Here, Nagel calls his rejection of supernatural teleology a, quote, ungrounded intellectual preference, unquote. His one grounded intellectual reason for rejecting theology is that he says a proper explanation of a natural phenomenon should show how the natural order itself holds together. But a divine action interrupts and therefore renders unintelligible certain features of the cosmos. By that standard, divine action isn't an explanation at all. It violates the intelligibility of the natural order from the inside. I'll return to this below. The conclusion of the syllogism, then, is that we must appeal to a natural teleology to explain the presence of mind in the cosmos. Nagel says, quote, if we take our impressions of objective value to be substantially correct rather than completely illusory, then we must regard the appearance and evolution of life as something more than a history of the development of self-reproducing organisms, as it is in the Darwinian version. So natural teleology, Darwinism plus. He calls it Darwinism plus. What is natural teleology? The details of natural teleology, he admits, are, quote, quite mysterious. But the concept is at least clear. Telos is, of course, the Greek word, a Greek word customarily translated end or purpose. But we ought not let customary translations limit our thinking. Telos does not always, perhaps not even primarily, denote the intentional purpose of an agent. The word is bursting, rather, with an array of possible meanings, including definite point, order, prize, realization. There exists plenty of order, definite points, and realizations in nature. Sunlight heats our planet without ever meaning to. Hearts pump blood without wishing to. So by teleology, let us mean any end-directed activity with or without purposive intention. So you might take as a cosmic example, the fact that the, what is it called, the galactic zone of life even appears in our galaxy. The fact that there is a zone where the stars have planets that are at such a distance as to allow for the presence of carbon-based life, that came to be, that was realized. That's just a fact, it came to be. So that would count as natural teleology on this argument. Nagel's arguing that for the existence of brute, natural teleological laws that explain mind in the cosmos. He adds two details. Oh, and by nature, let's mean the whole cosmos, including the Earth, the galaxies, and rational creatures like us. Right? So we're natural in that sense. Two details. First, teleological laws are different from other natural laws in that they govern living matter rather than dead matter. The existence of value seems to be coextensive with the existence of living things. Second, teleological laws, like efficient and material laws, are impersonal. They apply from everything to the beginning of the cosmos to the present. However, natural sort of physical laws govern physical phenomena at a given moment, right? So whatever two massive bodies are in relation to each other, there's a gravitational pull between the two at that moment. By contrast, teleological laws apply across time. He says, quote, some laws of nature would apply directly to the relation between the present and the future. This kind of governance is liable to sound exotic to a Darwinist, but it does not contradict Darwinism. Teleological explanation, if it exists, works with, not instead of, efficient and material explanations. So even if we reject the reductive story, we can preserve Darwinism. Nagel wants Darwinism plus. He explains, the natural world would have a propensity to give rise to beings of the kind that have a good. Beings for which things can be good or bad. They have appeared through the historical process of evolution, but part of the explanation for the existence of that process and of the possibilities upon which natural selection operates would be that they bring value into the world in a great variety of forms, unquote. In his most suggestively Hegelian sentence, Nagel says, The process seems to be one of the universe gradually waking up. He admits that his hypothesis is not likely to find favor with moral anti-realists or hard-headed atheists, but nevertheless, it promises to at least make sense of the presence of mind in the cosmos. Okay, so alternatives. Where do we go from here? We cannot easily deny the intentional teleology in our own human actions. We cannot really deny the appearance of teleology in natural organisms and organs. Hearts seem to be for pumping blood. Eyes seem to be for seeing. You might even say that the sun appears to be for heating the planet and causing photosynthesis and things like that. So there's three paths forward. This is sometimes called teleonomic behavior, to distinguish it from genuinely teleological, like intentional behavior. Teleonomic means it seems to obey teleological laws. That's from a fellow atheist of Nagel. Three paths would be to accept the reductive Darwinian naturalistic story and reduce or eliminate natural teleology, along with objective value and objective reason and everything else. Nagel actually, he builds the case that reductive naturalism can't explain objective value, but he also accounts life and consciousness and rationality as things it can't explain. But I focus on objective value because it's the strongest one. So that would be the first one. We have to get rid of natural teleology, but that we're going to have to get rid of objective value, and that's what we've already argued against. Number two is accepting teleology with theology, but giving an account of theology in which the intelligibility of God explains and fulfills the intelligibility of the world. And three, accept a secular natural teleology and flesh it out in more detail. That third path is Nagel's, as well as a slew of recent defenders. And I have a list of 4 or 5 people recently that are on the same kind of train as Nagel, either religious or secular forms of teleology. They are not uniform. Some are supernaturalists, others non-reductive or relaxed naturalists. The only thing that's out here is reductive naturalism. And I think that options 2 and 3 here allow for healthy controversy. I will not pursue my own preferred path, 2, here. I'll only say that both 2 and 3 not only seem more tenable than 1, they seem to be more scientific. Fighting words. Okay, so 2 quibbles with Nagel. Number 1, Plato and Aristotle are not atheists of the desired sort. Although Nagel admits his secular teleology is not fully sketched out, he finds friends in Plato and Aristotle, or the more nebulous naturalized Aristotelian alternative, or naturalized Platonist alternative. A glance at the historical Plato and Aristotle demonstrates they were not atheists of the desired sort. For example, with Plato, I content myself to cite authorities like Julia Annis and A.E. Taylor, who think that statements like the one in Laws are something like Plato's genuine view, which you may be familiar with. Quote, "You yourself and your friends are not the first nor the only persons to embrace atheism as your doctrine about the gods," says the Socratic stranger. "Nay, in every age there are sufferers from the malady, more or fewer." Atheism is a malady. Yeah, oh man. Some people contract that. What about Aristotle? With Aristotle, it's even more clear, just by virtue of his writing style, that Aristotle is some type of theist. His metaphysics, his philosophical anthropology, ethics, and epistemology are all defined with reference to the polarity between pure potential, prime matter, and pure actuality, which is God. In his natural teleology, active mind gives things both their form and telos. Usually formal and final cause go together, form and function. As Jonathan Lear summarizes, active mind makes all things. That is, it makes all things intelligible. It actually gives things their form. In Aristotle's theology, God always enjoys, quote, "a single and simple pleasure of peaceful contemplation." And Aristotle urges humans to imitate God and become intellectual. He says, "Man is most truly divine mental activity." right? We are our nous, most truly. This is all very quick. The form of the good and the active mind may not engage in special divine action or hear prayers or beget a son, but they are unabashedly non-naturalistic. And though Nagel never pretends to agree with Plato or Aristotle wholesale, their writings are hardly the kind of theorizing to inspire an atheist. He does say naturalized Platonism, but my question is naturalized Platonism sort of like non-triangular triangles? Second response is that, strictly speaking, one can be a Nagelian and an atheist, or a Nagelian and a theist of a certain sort. The supernaturalism that Nagel worries about is one where God violates the divine order. This is a serious charge against some conceptions of divine action. Nagel needs to say more, however, to respond to Christian philosophers who have shown how the incarnation of the divine word, for instance, is not a violation of the natural order, but an expression and fulfillment of the natural order. In other words, the divine word's presence does not rend the order of nature, it renders nature intelligible. It remains to Nagel to write a full treatment of this worry. It doesn't take up much space in Mind and Cosmos. I think he needs to do a whole book on this. And it remains to philosophers of religion to respond. My only point here is to respond that Nagel's teleology is indeterminate with respect to theism. He kind of sets it up like a disjunction, and all he says about theism is that he doesn't prefer that. He doesn't actually set it up as two logical, contradictory possibilities. This should not scare away atheists, but rather commend it to both theists and atheists. Historically, accepting natural teleology and Stoicism, for instance, does not necessarily entail accepting benevolent monotheism. There's a book that just came out last month, or January, by Tim Mulgan about non-theistic purposivism, he calls it. And it's not human-centered, it's not divine-centered, it's just purpose in the cosmos, purpose in the universe. I think it's the name of the book. The conclusion, Nagel contra mundum. Regardless of these quibbles, I think Nagel's case for natural teleology is persuasive. He poses the cosmic question in spite of opposition not only to his answer, but to even asking the cosmic question. His critique of reductive Darwinian naturalism is accurate and timely, and his defense of objective value, I think, is sound. I think his project is a promising one, partly because it is compatible both with certain kinds of theism and certain kinds of atheism. Indeed, natural teleology has received a windfall of recent defenders. Though I've tried to problematize his strategy of appropriating Plato and Aristotle to his purpose, I don't think a secular natural teleology is impossible. Even if his view is not very Platonic or Aristotelian, it still might be right. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. We've got some time for question and answer. I'll go ahead and open it up to the floor. Yes.
Hey, thanks for your talk. I was wondering, you kind of hovered around it a little bit, but I was wondering if Nagel ever explicitly dealt with or wrestled with alternative, like immanental conceptions of divinity. Like I'm thinking of, I'm working on the philosopher Josiah Royce, and that's his whole thing is he rejects a lot of the traditional conceptions of God and doesn't think that God is a transcendental being, but is actually immanent in the processes of the world. Is that sort of where he's going with that, or is that something that his position just kind of allows for?
I think he allows for it. I mean, Nagel is very aware of that he's irritating his atheist friends, right? I mean, he's trolling.
Right.
So I think that he didn't want to throw any more red meat than he already did.
Okay.
However, he does say, this whole idea of the universe waking up, which is in one sense literally true, right? I'm part of the universe and I'm awake. Therefore, the universe is awake in me. That's not airy-fairy woo. That's just true. But it does sound a little Hegelian, which maybe scares some people off. So if he said God is immanent, or maybe God is immanent, I think maybe for him he would just say, well, I'm just trying to come up with a secular alternative.
Okay.
And he's very clear this is a sketch. He says someone with more imagination could say more. So I tried to provide a little bit more of that idea of, like, for instance, laws. Laws are abstract, principles, if you will, that govern the natural world. They're part of the natural world, and that we can't have the cosmos without gravity. But gravity itself doesn't have a weight. doesn't
Right.
have a size. So I think that his view just leaves that open for people to say, yeah, the purpose is just a law. No, the purpose is this divine force that's,
Okay.
yeah, and that's why I mentioned Stoicism, because the logos of Stoicism
Right.
is a fire. It doesn't seem like it's a person,
Uh-huh.
but it's something more than just a law. It's something more than just math, right?
So, I guess not to monopolize here, but are there any sort of like metaphysical systems that he's like explicitly ruling out besides like a transcendent God that tears apart the natural order, or is he pretty fair game?
I don't see him leaving anything out yet.
Okay.
God talk, yes, sir.
Just to actually straight to this question because of the mention of Royce, I was just curious what your impression is. My impression is that alongside this doubt about reductive naturalism, the philosophical world is turning a bit again to idealism. And Royce was history not so long ago, and now it somehow isn't quite history. So I was just interested in whether you thought the return of idealist metaphysics in some quarters is connected in some way. My other question was that Dworkin produced a book, actually his lectures, it was published after he died, Religion Without God.
Yeah.
And it's a similar sort of theme about anti-reductionist theme, but he doesn't hesitate to call what's left religion, but is careful to say it's without God.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether, how you understand the difference. I'm not sure I understand. Nagel in some sense wants to go on being scientific,
Yeah.
whereas Dworkin was quite happy to give that up and say, no, this is about values, and this is the irreducible world of value. I'm just interested in, how do you see that difference? Is that just words, or do you think there's actually a deeper difference here?
Well, let me respond to the objective idealism
Yeah.
point and then remind me if I forget the rest of it. So he does say, now that I remember, he says, yeah, maybe you could call me an idealist. He's like, that's fine, but something more in the tradition of objective idealism, like Hegel and Plato. So he does, mention Hegel there with endorsement, like, oh, objective idealism, fine, if you want to call me that. All that meaning to say is ideas are not just in my head. There's ideas out there. In fact, the presence of ideas and values out there explain why a creature like me with ideas in my head comes to be. Because I have the practical reason just is this faculty for identifying what's worthwhile and what's not. What's to be pursued and what has to be pursuedness built into it. That's Mackey's phrase, right? He thinks that's ridiculous, but he admits that's the mainstream of Western, European world philosophy. There are values out there, and I discovered them. So I think if you call them an objective idealist, then he would just say, well, sure. I don't mean it's only ideas, because he's a scientific realist about, Darwinism, about cosmology and everything else. Matter is there too. So what is that? I don't know. Is that Hegel? I'm just reading Hegel for the first time. So
This out there is a very un-Hegelian way of speaking.
Yeah. Well, so the second part, religion without God. So I believe in religion with God, but the religion without God people are very interesting to me, like Slavoj Žižek. My last paper was about how Kung Fu Panda, it was a film conference, Kung Fu Panda is this sort of like Slavoj Žižek, like nihilism in a movie. And I think that's an interesting trend, and I think that to me, I'd rather take a little bit in the right direction. And so if you're willing to say the world is not just, atoms spinning in the void, great. We can be friends. But then let's also go on to talk about why is it that religion is so socially useful, let's say, or why is it that people who pray, even though they don't believe in God, feel so much consolation from that. Roger Scruton gave a talk last year on intransitive prayer, praying without an object.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
By the way, James Delmack from SLU. I guess I have maybe two questions. So I haven't read Nagel's book. I've been meaning to. And the first is somewhat more clarification, but the second is maybe pushing a little bit more. So the first is, I'm not entirely sure what he means by teleology and what role that's supposed to play. So when we start talking about like teleonomic functions to things, I guess I don't understand how that leads to the reliability of reasoning in a way that would be non-naturalist in the right kind of way. So it seems to me perfectly plausible to say something like there was a very famous what's his name? There are a number of Darwinian biologists who do systematics in biology. I'm forgetting the one guy's name. Mack or starts with M.
Ernst Mayr?
Mayr. He believed in teleonomic activity in Darwinian biology. He thought it was essential to it.
Yeah.
And I think he's right. There are lots of them that do. But that doesn't seem to me to liberate the mind, as it were, from matter in the right way.
Gotcha.
Because it seems like the idea is behind Nagel's thought here is something like that the mind is operating non-naturally and the reasons are real. They're not just influenced by the bare processes of matter, but putting teleonomic function into like material processes doesn't make this come out right.
Yeah.
So the fact that let's say the proto-human beings were being motivated in the right kinds of ways, all of their organs had teleonomic function, right? Like that doesn't like lead to the brain developing in a way other than its proper function becomes to identify the right kinds of things in the world for action, right? Depending on what you pick as the goal. And the only way you can get out of that is by saying, well, the telos of the mind is something that's like non-natural, universal to that, and they're not just practical action for reproduction. But that's a much stronger claim that doesn't seem to me to be ensured by teleology.
Can I respond to that before you go to this? I can only do one thing at a time.
Yeah, no,
So first thing I want to say is, yes, please do read the book. It came out in 2012, but part of my reason for giving this talk is to commend it to you all because it's really fun. It's a fun read. He doesn't say, look, natural teleology, that helps underwrite, rationalism or realism about knowledge. He says, we know things. Reason works. Reason can identify universals. It somehow works. Now, what do we have to do to our Darwinian biology to allow what we know to be true to be true? So, like, for instance, in The Last Word, it's a whole book about, reason is objective, and we can't think otherwise. So that's his starting point. We just discover ourselves to have objective reason, and he includes objective practical reason within that. And he says our view of the cosmos can't make it impossible that creatures like us exist. So that's why this book he expands his scope farther than he ever has, I think, to say what must be true of the cosmos, given that we exist. And I don't know, basically, you can think of it, he says it's mysterious, you can think of it this way. At state 1, there was no life in the universe and no conditions for life. At state 2, there was the conditions for life in the universe, but no life yet. And at state 3, there was the conditions for life and life. Why, what story would plot all of those data points? Random chance could plot all those data points, but it would take, so long, and it would be so implausible, and blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, oh, one of the natural laws at work there is not just gravity, but also a propensity to bring about life.
I think that's maybe a stronger or non-Aristotelian type of teleology.
Yeah.
And that's maybe, the second is, it seems like maybe what he's going for, and this is maybe in some sense a yes or no question, is he arguing for a stronger conception that this kind of teleology provides, like, human beings have a place in the cosmos? Because you use that language, and it's like, strikes me as quasi-Teilhard de Chardin's kind of language, that, like, the universe is directed to bring about consciousness. But it seems to me that where I want to push on that is say, it seems when you go toward like teleonomic function, like in a very local way, or you just understand it as like essences, you can do a very naturalized project. But when you start conceiving of teleology of the universe qua whole,
Yeah.
and the cosmos,
Yeah.
and proper places and functions within it, you've got to have some account of the whole, which probably will involve something non-natural. Because I mean, that's where Aristotle and that get, the prime mover and all of these other things. So that's where that's a very great chain of being kind of thought.
I think the probably is where he wants to live. He says, yeah, probably it'll involve a God or a divine mind, but what if it didn't? And that's where he's camping out. He's just staking out his claim. I've got a little sliver here, got theism, and I got, denying teleology over there. And I think that it actually makes sense to me because it's not just that, there's little teleonomic functions on Earth. It's that the Earth is a very rare type of planet in our galaxy and maybe the whole, or our solar system and maybe in our whole galaxy and who knows beyond that. The Earth is a weird place. So why is that? Well, maybe the universe, there's these natural laws that he says they aren't mechanistic in the sense that like every time something happens, it's going to be beneficial for life one day. No, it's just that there's a propensity that one of these billions and billions of planets is going to have the conditions for life. And there's a propensity, so he talks about like, he doesn't go into the details of evolution, but like, one of the puzzles about evolution is that the space between the first hypothesized first living thing to now hasn't been enough time for random mutations, natural selection operating on random mutations to produce all of this diversity. There just hasn't been enough time. There's been enough time maybe to produce an eye, but not a species, and certainly not millions of species, right, or hundreds of thousands. So the natural teleology would provide a possible answer to that question. Oh, these random mutations, they happen randomly, but when one that will favor life or favor complexity happens, there's a law that, if you will, clicks that into place. Oh, yep, now we're getting closer to maybe producing people like us. And I think that's the answer to your question about our place in the cosmos. He looks around and says, we're pretty cool. Bacteria has a good, it can die or it can live. Dogs and deer have a good. They can't recognize it. We can recognize not only our good, but their good. That's pretty cool. That makes us different. Did that answer it? Yeah.
So then would, say, some other planet, maybe not in our galaxy, whatever, has life that's perhaps more intelligible than we are and has this other level of consciousness higher than us, then does that degrade our purpose of the universe?
I don't think so. Do you think it might?
Well, I mean, you just gave the comparison between us and bacteria, that it's like at these certain levels. I just feel like he's arguing that we are the highest.
Well, we're certainly the highest that we know of, yeah.
Yeah, that we know. Yeah.
But I mean, if we discovered, say, intelligent Martians that were more intelligent and more advanced or whatever, I'm sure we'd feel admiration for them, as long as they were moral, not evil.
Yeah.
But we feel admiration. We say, wow, I know what it means to be a higher being than me. Like, if that's what you are, that's great, So I don't think that he's arguing that we're like somehow the height, the pinnacle. We are God come to life for the first time. It's just looking around. We're the best we know of. And that maybe helps us to explain our place in the cosmos. I don't know if he has any more to it than that, right? Is there a function to inhabit Mars or something like that? I don't know.
So in the debate, the sort of three camps, the top one was sort of Darwinian rejectionism.
Yeah.
In this, either Nagel's book or in the relevant literature, who do they think inhabits that space? Because I'm thinking, so I work in the history of philosophy, right? I'm thinking, sort of late medieval thinkers. They're willing to bracket theism, but they don't live in that space. You get Spinoza. Spinoza has a conception of teleology. He doesn't live in that space.
Mm-hmm.
You get Hume. Hume appeals to teleological notions frequently. So he'll reject there was the Thomistic conception of final causation, but he's happy to appeal to teleological language. So it looks like in the history of philosophy, at least up through, say, the 18th century, you get no one really inhabiting the space that allegedly is in the camp that Nagel seems to be pushing against. So I'm just wondering, that seems to me like a really naive reading of the history of philosophy. So I'm wondering who actually do people think inhabits that space?
And you're
among
saying
philosophers?
the space of secular natural theology? Teleology? Number
So let's see.
3? Because the first two make sense, right? God and purpose, or no God, no purpose. Those kind of make sense.
Sorry, maybe I was misunderstanding this category. So there seems to be a category of maybe it's, natural teleology. Well, why don't you tell me who inhabits that space? We'll go from there. I'll see.
Well, that I take it is any moral anti-realist who's also an atheist or a physicalist, right? Who just says that's number one. Person who says the universe is characterized by efficient and material laws. Those laws explain even my consciousness. We maybe don't know how yet, but eventually we'll figure out how the brain causes all my mental states or whatever. The end.
Yeah. So good. So I followed it in the abstract. I'm just wondering who is it that Nagel and or others think are actual names that fit in that definite description? Because I think I look at sort of figures in the history of philosophy. And I think I don't see like.
Oh, so you're saying Hume doesn't even fit in that? Because I think Hume would be a caricature.
I require an argument for that. I have an argument for that. I require and have an argument for that.
Yes.
But yeah. So he'll think like Hume or like.
Well, Francis Bacon, I suppose. I mean,
Okay.
but yeah. Does anyone?
John Stuart Mill,
Who?
John Stuart Mill.
Oh, Mill. Okay. Yeah.
The Churchlands?
Yeah, so I'm wondering
Not
when sort of historically this, what are the names that are in that camp, and when historically does this arise? Because it looks to me like it might be a much smaller population, I think, people in the debate might actually think is the case.
I think one of the things Nagel does, I mean, the book's 128 pages too. One of the things he does is does a lot of lumping, and he says like subjectivism. He's like, I'm not going to deal with freaking quasi-realism over there. Like I'm just going to subjectivism. It's all big. So in this, it's anyone who, like him, is an atheist, but also I would count in number one like the moral anti-realists, like your Mackey and your Simon Blackburn and your Alan Gibbard. I mean, Alan Gibbard is probably a good example because he tries to give a kind of cosmic story of how we evolved and how practical reason is yet not objective. Like it's really important that practical reason isn't what it seems to be.
And he also denies natural teleology.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me, am I hearing this right? It sounds to me that it's certainly so the Churchlands, right? So it's certainly a 20th century phenomenon. It might go back to Mill, right? But it sounds to me like a more recent kind of phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah, Lucretius maybe, yeah. There may be more references to that in the book that I'm not remembering. But I thought you were asking who else occupies point 3, and that's what I was going to say. There's very few. I mean, it's Nagel and who? I mean, I did find this Tim Olgan guy, but it's a strange space.
Well, in the history of philosophy, I think there are folks who occupy that space. I think that Spinoza is a version of a guy who occupies that space. I think Hume is a guy who occupies that space. I think you can find late medieval figures who occupy that space with at least the sort of bracketing theism, sort of finding it unacceptable. Not even finding it unacceptable, finding it unnecessary to so I think Grotius occupies that space.
Grotius?
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, and my interest, and feel free to jump in, but my interest is with math or medicine, we can make discoveries whether or not we agree about God. And is teleology one of those things, or is it maybe more like angelology, where we have to agree on some substantive stuff about the supernatural to even have that conversation? And I'm coming to think that teleology is just a fact of nature.
Would you make anything of granting as potentially granting as a sort of extra step? So let's suppose that Nagel's natural teleology is scientific,
Yes.
whatever that means.
Yes.
Well, Nagel's granting his argument is that without theism, science is anti-teleological.
Yeah.
So it kind of, which I think is an interesting extra step.
Yeah.
Do you know if anyone has pushed back on, because I know William Paley might have had his finger on this, the idea of, hey, you guys say there's a principle of order or laws of material nature. How does this, because naturalism is a sort of negative ontology, right? It's the denial of something or other. So how is this sort of adding to your repertoire of causation in the universe or about the universe?
Mm-hmm.
So to play off of Paley here, how would, because you say, or you point out, and I haven't unfortunately looked at Nagel's work thoroughly, but does he just leave that question open and say we have yet to fill in the details? Because it's sort of like laws of nature don't cause things, right? I mean, that was Paley's point. So what is it that's doing it?
Mm-hmm.
And to deny something about reality, to say that God doesn't exist, angels don't exist, so forth. We reduce our metaphysical inventory to only the physical, and there's teleology.
Right.
So I'm trying to figure out how three manages to survive into, other than looking like a sort of counterpart to the God of the gaps.
Right. Right, and he does respond to the God of the gaps thing, but so it's not just, okay, we've denied all these beings that could potentially cause this to happen, but look, the effect is still here. I think, the imminent kind of idea is maybe closer, where it's like, we have to explain why there's mind in the cosmos. This would explain it. Now let's go where he got the details. Now, I didn't quote it, but at one point he summarizes his view, and he uses a quadruple negative, right? And there was a reviewer that was teasing him about the quadruple negative. It was a Herculean quadruple negative. He says, I'm not sure that, this is on page 93 of Mind and Cosmos. I am not confident that this Aristotelian idea of teleology without intention makes sense, but I do not at the moment see why it doesn't.
It just seems reaching.
Yeah.
Paley's pushing back here, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, what's the response?
So one of my professors said there's two kinds of explanations for things. There's like a mechanistic, physical, empirical history of evolution, right? So why does the heart pump blood? I can tell you an empirical story for why the heart pumps blood.
Right.
And the other one is an agent brought it about, that the watch, tells time. But he basically said that's an exhaustive disjunction, so if you're telling me it's not made by God, then it has to be evolved. And I think Nagel's response would be, but that doesn't explain inorganic stuff like the cosmos, like the development of a galactic zone of life. There's no natural selection operating on inorganic matter, right? There's no random mutation. There's just, so it might be that the laws of, for instance, gravity, the laws of the way that, I don't know what to call it, the astrophysical laws of how stars form, let's say, and how they explode. Those laws themselves are impinged upon by this other law that is a propensity to bring about, say, planets. Even why are there planets? Why are there not just dust and stars? That kind of a thing, you need to be able to say something brought about those planets. I don't know if that's answering the concern.
Well, maybe there's not an answer. Maybe that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
I'm just finding that historically, Paley laid down the gauntlet to divide, or to say three is in a sense impossible,
Yeah.
or unreasonable, I should say.
Have you come across Nagel addressing the Gestalt psychologists? I was kind of expecting to see that in Mind and Cosmos, because one of the points is that qualitatively other effects come from the sum of the parts, which is distinct from the sum of the parts. And I was kind of surprised to see that he didn't make mention to the psychology with regard to teleology, and that teleology might be some quality of the other thing that arises from the sum of parts. It is different from the sum of parts. So have you seen Nagel come across or mention the psychology at all?
I haven't seen that.
Thank you.
Cheers. Got time for coffee before the next session. Thanks for coming, guys. Are you all here?
Yeah, I presented yesterday.
Oh, you did? Okay,
Undergrad.
cool, undergrad. Yeah. How'd it go?
Not my best one. My paper printed out every other page, and I didn't notice till my presentation started.
No.
So then I had to load up my laptop.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say you had to wing it.
No. That would have been a train wreck.
Yeah.
Would you present on?
Josiah Royce's answer to the problem of
great.
evil.
David, yeah.
It's, I make a distinction
So
between
far, the two sessions I've
the
been to, they haven't.
narrow problem of evil, what I call the narrow problem of evil, which is
Say a few words.
the traditional problem of evil, and the broad problem of evil,
Comments and criticism.
which is just what is evil, why does it exist, and how can we manage it, that sort of thing. So Josiah Royce
No, hey,
answers
that's
the broad
fine.
problem.
I like to spar a
And
little
kind of,
bit, you know, but.
it's
Take a
still a
step.
little
Yeah.
muddled right
Yeah.
now, but what
I'll
I'm trying to go for is I'm trying to say, okay, so Josiah Royce has this answer to the broad problem of evil, and some traditional answers to the narrow problem of evil have these problems. So philosophers in like the Abrahamic tradition should look towards Josiah Royce, look at his answer to the broad problem of evil, and sort of engage with that, and hopefully open up some more dialogue.
Interesting.
Yeah, so.
Well, so how was the content received?
I think pretty well. I think there was one guy that really got it, and I think was really interested, and then there's one guy that I don't think